Good morning and welcome to Seattle Atheist Church. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. I will share with you our creed. We are founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. I think I just touched the speaker's thing and changed that. We attempt to be excellent to all conscious beings, so my apologies. And we believe in good, because good works in non-mysterious ways. So the members ourselves give the talks, and afterwards we get into a circle and we have a discussion. So please come on up. Stephen, thank you for being here.
All right, hey, thank you everyone for coming today. So this is going to be a super ambitious talk. I'm going to try within the next 30 minutes to give you a framework to think about human morality and human happiness. So that's pretty ambitious. It'll be great. You'll love it. So let's start with the morality part. And I want to start, as I often do, by talking about Darwin. And Darwin famously had a passage in The Descent of Man where he gives his theory of morality. It's a really short paragraph. He writes, "There can be no doubt that a tribe including many members who, from possessing in a high degree the spirit of patriotism, fidelity, obedience, courage, and sympathy, were always ready to aid one another and to sacrifice themselves for the common good, would be victorious over most other tribes, and this would be natural selection." Right? So that's Darwin's theory of morality. You get morality when you have tribe versus tribe. People in tribes who have members who are more courageous than other tribes or willing to sacrifice themselves for the group good. Those are the tribes that win out over time. And so that's how we get these moral sentiments. They're all about the behavior of the group rather than the behavior of the individual. So Darwin believed that we have specific emotions developed to promote group morality. He wrote a whole book on the emotions, right? The expression of emotions in man and animals. But in The Descent of Man, he also brings up the subject. He writes, "Ultimately, our moral sense or conscience becomes a highly complex sentiment originating in the social instincts, largely guided by the approbation of our fellow men, ruled by reason, self-interest, and in later times by deep religious feelings, and confirmed by instruction and habit." So that's overall Darwin's theory. It was radical at the time, not very well fleshed out at the time, but it was the beginnings of sort of a theory about how you can use natural selection to explain human morality, not just all of nature, but also, capture the way that humans behave within the framework. So more recently, David Sloane Wilson wrote a book called Darwin's Cathedral. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this book. How many of you, just out of curiosity, have read Darwin's Cathedral? It's really, oh great, fantastic. It's a really good book. I actually came across this book because in preparing for this talk, I started by reading Jonathan Haidt's book on the happiness hypothesis. I got to the last chapter of his book and he said, "Oh, I just believe everything that David Sloane Wilson wrote in Darwin's Cathedral. Go read that book." So I did. I went off and read the book, and I'll get back to Haidt later on in this talk when we get closer to happiness. But I want to start by explaining how David Sloane Wilson fleshed out the ideas of Darwin. So in David Sloane Wilson's book, he has one central thesis. Super controversial. This is a thesis. Religion is a group-level adaptation. That's the central thesis of the book, that religions exist as a group-level adaptation. Or, as he says later in the book, a can opener is designed to open cans, and Calvinism is designed to make a human community function as an adaptive unit. So he's pretty blunt about this. He wants to claim that religion provides communities, tribes, with secular utility. So it's not just the superstitious part, it actually has real utility for human lives. Religions do. He wants to claim that religions live or die just like exactly the same way as any other organism, and they can be weeded out through natural selection. And he argues that the ones that survive provide its members with real-world benefits. And he gives a good example. He actually looks at multiple religions to analyze, to prove his thesis. I'm going to focus on one religion. One of the religions he focuses on is early Christianity, to try to show that by being a Christian, by being part of that tribe, gave you some benefits over being, a Roman, another member of the Roman Empire. So he talks about in the early history of Christianity, the Christian church had only about 1,000 members in the year 40, but grew to such a high percentage of the Roman Empire by the year 350 that the Emperor of Rome, Constantine, converted. And so the question is, how did it grow so quickly? How did Christianity take over? How did it become such a big deal? Well, the first issue was apparently Romans had a huge reproduction problem. They didn't reproduce very effectively. So Sloane writes, Roman culture developed in a way that became hostile to biological reproduction despite the availability of resources. Part of the problem was extreme male domination and a form of status striving that made marriage and families unattractive prospects for males. Female infanticide was so common that Russell estimated a sex ratio of 131 males per 100 females in Rome and 140 males per 100 females in Italy, Asia Minor, and North Africa. Preference for sons can be adaptive at the level of a single patriarchal lineage, competing with all other lineages, but it can have disastrous consequences at the scale of the whole society. This is my favorite part. Julius Caesar attempted to stimulate reproduction by awarding land to fathers of 3 or more children and considered legislation outlawing celibacy. So try to pass that. In contrast, the Christian religion expected marriage, abundant children, fidelity in both sexes, while outlawing abortion, infanticide, and non-reproductive sexual practices. When stated as a religious imperative and enforced by the social control mechanisms that come naturally to small encapsulated groups, Christianity succeeded at changing reproductive behavior as Roman law never could. Christian women raised more babies than their pagan counterparts. So this is looking purely from a point of view of natural selection. You had differential reproductive success. Christians produced more babies, spread faster, was able to grow quicker as a religion. He talks about one of the things he talks about some alternative sects at the same time. There's the Essenes and there were some other Christian sects that didn't have these practices around promoting reproduction, and they didn't expand as quickly. Okay, so another thing that early Christians got right was the way that they handled natural disasters. Now, I was a little shocked when reading the book. David Sloane Wilson talks about how horrible it was to live between like the year 0 and 300 in Roman times. He talked about the number of earthquakes that happened, how often cities got looted, just horrible things. It was a horrible time to be alive. You would not want to live at that time. But one of the things that struck was plagues. They had these massive plagues, and they actually had 2 plagues between, like the year 0 and the year 315. The first plague killed a quarter of the population, of the entire population. The second plague killed a third of the population. So these are a lot of people dying off from these plagues. One of the critical reasons that Christianity took off in that time was because Romans and Christians responded to plagues in different ways. Dionysius, who was alive at the time, I think he was alive at the year 40, described the way that Christians responded to plagues in this way. Most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ. So basically, Christians, when a fellow Christian got the plague, they would try to nurse them back to health. They would risk getting the plague themselves to be able to help as many people as possible. Now contrast this with the Romans. The heathen behaved in the very opposite way. At the first onset of the disease, They pushed the sufferers away and fled from their dearest, throwing them into the roads before they were dead, and treated unburied corpses as dirt, hoping thereby to avert the spread and contagion of the fatal disease. But do what they might, they found it difficult to escape. So Romans would be...
Don't that have words better?
No, you horrible heathen, you. So, no, the reason it didn't work better is it turns out that just providing food and water to someone dying of the plague decreases the mortality rate by 2/3. That the main reason that, one of the main reasons all these people were dying off of the plague is as soon as they got it, they couldn't get any food or water and they died off. So even though it was riskier to take care of someone who has the plague because you might catch it yourself, it actually increased the survival rate dramatically just to provide some food and water too. So the Christians, again, more reproductive success, right? Less Christians dying off, more Romans dying off. All right, so he gives David Sloane Wilson gives some other examples. I'm not going to go into that, but the general thesis is, again, morality works at the level of tribes. It has to be differential reproductive success at the level of tribes, and he tries to analyze some religions in the past to show, well, what random characteristics came together to explain why those religions survived and other ones didn't. And, again, just to be clear here, the thesis is this is unconscious. It's not like, the early Christians sat down and said, how can we beat those Romans in reproductive success? It's just that there are these different sects that sprung up, and some of them adopted practices that allowed them to be more successful than others in the sense of fitness reproduction at the level of a group. All right, so I want to spend a little bit of time clarifying this thesis more. So I want to start with the concept of group level selectionism. The history there is so group level selectionism was not accepted as a serious theory to explain things, and in fact is still extremely controversial. But I just want to clarify that David Sloane Wilson isn't talking about kin selection, and he's not talking about reciprocal altruism. Both of those most people accept at this point are ways to explain altruism. He is talking about the Darwinian type of group level selectionism, higher level selectionism that Darwin was talking about when he was talking about tribe versus tribe. He says that there are he quotes Mashad, who talks about the history of life on this planet can be understood as organization at higher and higher levels. Mashad writes, the major transitions in evolutionary units are from individual genes to networks of genes, from gene networks to bacteria-like cells, from bacteria-like cells to I'm not going to pronounce this word, eukaryotic, thank you. Cells with organelles, from cells to multicellular organisms, and from solitary organisms to society. So greater and greater organization over time. Human body is a fantastic example of a group of organisms working together in a collective whole. Human body consists of over 37 trillion cells, all working together every day to make you. So we have examples of higher level organizations around us all the time. Okay. The other thing I want to clarify about his thesis is when he's talking about evolution, he's not talking about purely genetic evolution. He's also talking about cultural evolution. And in fact, it's clear from what he writes that he thinks cultural evolution is more important than genetic evolution when describing things at the time scale that we're talking about. He writes, it is unfortunate that evolution is so often associated with genetic evolution, a slow process that gives the impression of an incapacity for change over the timescales that matter most to living people struggling with their problems. He believes that that evolution works the same way as on ideas as it does on genes. Now consider a cultural mutation, a new belief or practice that arises in one group by chance, rational thought, or any other process. Unlike genetic mutations, the cultural mutation need not remain at a low frequency within the group. A variety of factors can swiftly make the mutant behavior the majority or even the exclusive behavior practiced by the group. Perhaps members think explicitly about the new belief or practice, appreciate its wisdom and establish it as a new norm. Perhaps they follow mindlessly because it is espoused by a charismatic member of the group. The point is, if it's cultural evolution, it can be very fast, right? he does believe that people have an innate psychology, and some of this innate psychology is devoted to social sentiments and social emotions. He likes the 2B and Cosmides stuff that we've talked about in the past. These are, innate psychological mechanisms, but he thinks that they are the, quote, musical instruments, or, quote, building blocks from which innumerable cultural symphonies or structures can be built. So, he's very much into an interaction between culture and innate genetic emotions to explain the behavior of humans at the level of a tribe. Next thing I want to clarify about his thesis, by religion, he definitely does not mean just superstition. And so he writes, defining religion purely in terms of supernatural agents seems shallow in addition to narrow. So he doesn't want to just say religion is a belief in the supernatural. He points out that the word religion is derived from the Latin religio, which means to unite or bind together. A related word is ligature, which means to tie together. I actually didn't know that. I didn't know religion meant to tie together. So he writes that Durkheim, we'll talk more about Durkheim in a few moments, but Durkheim's definition of religion is on the right track. Durkheim defines religion as a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things. That is to say, things set apart and forbidden. Beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community called a church, all those who adhere to them. So what is that? That introduces the question, well, what does it mean by sacred? If being religious is all about recognizing the sacred, what does it mean to be sacred? So he gives some examples in the book of what he considers sacred. I'll give you one example. This is one of my favorite ones. He gives the example of the leopard-skinned chief. And the idea of the leopard-skinned chief is there's this tribe called the Nur tribe. And the Nur tribe is very violent. Honor is super important. You can, violate someone's honor. They immediately start killing people. Hair trigger violence all the time. But there's a way to opt out of this violence. So let's say that you go over and you kill someone else and they want retribution. You can always go to the tent of the leopard skin chief, and you are protected in the tent of the leopard skin chief. People can't kill you there. And then the leopard skin chief will act on your behalf, and he will negotiate for you. You have to give up some cattle in exchange for, killing the person. But he will actually act as a representative for you so that the normal violent practices don't happen. Wilson writes, the leopard skin chief is a sacred personage and must be so to perform his secular function. He has no real power and is even chosen from an unimportant lineage so that he can be nonpartisan when negotiating with the more powerful lineages. There's nothing whatsoever preventing the victim's kin from rushing into the leopard skin chief's compound to kill the slayer, other than the respect for the sacred office. So this will give you some sense of what David Sloane Wilson means by sacred, that it's, again, this all has to be explained for him in terms of secular utility. But in this case, the sacredness protects this office and allows the institution to work. Finally, so David Sloane Wilson makes a distinction between something called practical realism and factual realism. David Sloane Wilson admits that religion is factually just not true. But he wants to claim that religion has significant practical reality, and that's even more important than factual reality. He writes, how can Christians preach forgiveness when they are so judgmental about people's behavior? How can they preach the golden rule while waging war? Should a true Christian forgive someone who commits a horrific crime that remains unpunished? One form of hell for me would be to be locked for eternity in a room full of people who make these observations again and again as if for the first time. These observations portray religion as stupid, when in fact it is the observer who is stupid for failing to grasp the full complexity of what religion must do to serve its people. So at this point, David Sloane Wilson, eminent biologist, sounds like a 5-year-old calling people stupid, but so I want to explain. I want to try to do the best I can to explain what he's saying here. So this is the last chapter of the book, and what he's trying to do is, again, make a distinction about what the purpose of religion is. And from his perspective, the purpose of a religion is to come up with these beliefs, even if they happen to be completely crazy beliefs, that allow one tribe to be more successful than another tribe. So this isn't his example, this is my example, but I'm going to try to explain this as best as I can. Imagine that you have two tribes. You have one tribe of Vikings, and they believe that if they're brave in battle, they get to die and go off to Valhalla, right? And they get non-stop wine for all eternity. I don't know what you get in Valhalla. Good stuff. You get really good stuff in Valhalla. But you have this other tribe of atheists. And these atheists, they are factually correct about everything. Nothing happens when they're dying. There's no Valhalla. Now you have a battle between these two tribes. Who do you think is going to win? My suspicion is people who are brave in battle, who believe that they'll go off to Valhalla, will have a leg up on the stupid atheists who are saying, I don't want to die here. So I think the point he's trying to make is even, crazy beliefs can have a lot of good consequences in the real world if it motivates people in the right way and changes their behavior. I see people nodding their heads. I'm in agreement with that, but we'll get to that later on. All right. So what does this have to do with happiness? This is supposed to be a talk on happiness. I've been talking about morality for a really long time now. So I believe that happiness and morality are very closely linked. If Darwin and David Sloane Wilson are right, then you are a social animal to your core. You are part of a larger organism. David Sloane Wilson takes the organism analogy seriously, or more likely several large organisms. You are a member of a church, a football team, a company, a country, and a family. Your groups, through a combination of genetic and cultural evolution, determine your values, and your happiness is partly determined by how well you measure yourself against these group values. If these guys are right, if Darwin and David Sloane Wilson are right, you have an innate psychology that causes you to feel anger when there is a transgression against a social norm, pride when a respected member of your tribe praises you, and elevation when in the presence of a noble act. And I just want to pause for a moment on the concept of elevation. This was a new concept for an emotion that came from the Jonathan Haidt book on happiness. I want to talk a little bit about that. He describes it again in the happiness hypothesis. He writes, "For the past 7 years, I've been studying elevation in the lab. My students and I have used a variety of means to induce elevation, and have found that video clips from documentaries about heroes and altruists and selections from the Oprah Winfrey Show work well." So if you want to create an emotion of elevation, watch Oprah Winfrey. Work well. The idea here is people really do respond emotionally to acts of moral beauty, and these emotional reactions involve warm or pleasant feelings in the chest and conscious desires to help others or become a better person oneself. So they wanted to show that the emotion of elevation was connected to, this is Haidt and the students, is connected to the vagus nerve. Vagus, whatever. The vagus nerve. That's around your heart. Vegas, is it? Okay, cool. I'll call it the vagus nerve. Which is around your heart, because they said that often when people experience the feeling of elevation, they point to their heart. And they want to say, well, there's a good reason for that. There's a nerve right there, and that's actually connected with the production of oxytocin, which we've talked about before in this church, that it creates feelings of warmness and love and happiness, and that these things are connected together. So they wanted to show that when people experience the emotion of elevation, it actually increased the oxytocin level in their blood. Now, they didn't have the money to do blood draws. So what they really wanted to do is draw the blood of these participants in their study before they watched the Oprah Winfrey Show, and then afterward and show oxytocin going up. They couldn't afford that. So what they did, this is great, what they did is they came up with a more creative way of measuring this. In one of the boldest undergraduate honors thesis ever done in the UVA psychology department, Jin, that's one of his students, brought 45 lactating women into her lab one at a time. with their babies and asked them to insert nursing pads into their bras. Half the women then watched an elevating clip from an Oprah Winfrey show. It was about a musician who, after expressing his gratitude to the music teacher who had saved him from a life of gang violence, finds out that Oprah has brought in some of his own students to express their gratitude to him. The other mothers saw a video clip featuring several comedians. The women watched the videos in a private screening room, and a video camera, not hidden, recorded their behavior. When the videos were over, the mothers were left alone with their children for 5 minutes. At the end of the study, Jen weighed the nursing pads to measure milk release, and later coded the videos to whether the mothers nursed their babies or played warmly with them. The effect was one of the biggest I have ever found in any study. Nearly half of the mothers in the elevation condition either leaked milk or nursed their babies. Only a few of the mothers in the comedy condition leaked or nursed. So the idea is oxytocin, promotes lactation. And so by bringing in nursing mothers, this gave them an indirect way to measure whether oxytocin levels went up in their blood. So the idea is this emotion of elevation is, a real emotion that has psychological effects. I don't want to put too much weight on this study. This is obviously one, undergraduate senior honors thesis with 45 lactating women who, I don't know if the study's ever been reproduced or whatever, but the general point about this approach to understanding morality is, again, this is no different than what Darwin was talking about from the original quotes, the idea that humans have certain innate moral sentiments that are targeted at social, at group level things, including things like elevation. Darwin himself, in the expression of emotions in man and animals, one of the emotions that he pulls out is blushing. He has a whole chapter where he starts by talking about blushing, where he says humans are the only animals on earth that blush. And he wants to say because it's a social emotion, and humans, much more so than other animals, are attuned to their social groups. All right, so I want to get to the conclusion. So to conclude, Durkheim, who I mentioned before, he's the founder of the academic discipline of sociology. He started sociology. He lived late 1800s, early 1900s. He was an atheist, but he also believed in the importance of religion in providing meaning to people's lives. He worried about modernization and the loss of the sacred. He was very much into the sacred and the profane. Durkheim coined the word anomie, which is associated with, quote, a condition in which society provides little moral guidance to individuals. And that's a bad thing, right? One of his most important works was on suicide and on differences in the suicide rates among religious versus non-religious. And he claimed that the explanation for that was non-religious people had more anomie because they had less moral guidance. So one of the goals of our church is to provide a sense of the sacred without the superstition. And unlike other religions, our church was founded to enable practical realism and factual realism to coincide. All right, I'm going to stop there. Let's discuss.